Okay, picking up where we left off, we're talking about the milk revolution, really the changes that have begun after the last major glacial came to an end during the Pleistocene. We see an increase in climatic temperatures. This led to a warming trend, and we continue to see that warming trend throughout time. Humans, of course, are accelerating that natural trend that is occurring ever since about the 1800s. But either way, within the anthropological perspective, we always want to try to understand how humans are adapting to their environment and the situations that they find themselves in, along with all of those stressors. So as the last glacial came to an end, there were a number of new stressors that were placed on populations. Not only did this lead to the Neolithic Revolution, the invention of farming, as people learned to settle around the grains that were starting to become more abundant. They also started to engage in animal husbandry. They kept animals, domesticated animals, and that reshaped, for example, the disease patterns that humans previously experienced. We now undergo an epidemiological transition where epidemic disease or infectious disease, as obtained from and through practices such as floodplain irrigation, in addition to keeping animals, we see that that becomes the major cause of mortality and morbidity. So infectious disease now becomes a problem. In addition to that, we see the adoption of a number of cultural practices, and quite often people tend to think that almost in a Lamarckian way, and think back to biology. Lamarck, he had argued that within an evolutionary model, the neck of giraffes, they became longer through experience, and the more that they reached up for leaves, that was passed on to the next generation. So what a parent did is passed on to the offspring. Within that same type of thinking, people have argued, or they've thought, within popular culture, as people started to drink more milk, eventually we learned to digest it. That's not what happened. We have a mutation that takes place that allows certain populations, and not all populations, an advantage, lactase persistence, and the ability to drink milk without the digestive issues associated with it. So within certain populations, we see this new adaptive advantage emerge, and it's certainly connected to a number of the stressors that took place following the end of the last glacial major. So looking at the milk revolution, then, we're going to look at a time frame between 11,500 years before the present to 6,500 years before the present, and try to understand a little bit about why this took place from a genetic perspective, and from a theoretical perspective, some of the advantages that drinking milk would have provided populations. All right, so with respect to the milk revolution, then, like I said, it's not a matter of becoming experienced drinking milk, but the human experience daring does play a role in creating a situation within which a mutation eventually becomes fixed within a population because it serves a selective advantage. Milk, it's often regarded as toxic. Some people say it's not natural to drink milk. When we think about the toxicity of milk, it's not that it's poisonous, but it does lead to the inability to break down sugars because that lactase enzyme isn't present. It ultimately leads to the inability to break down the sugars. They ferment in the gut, and it leads to bloating, flatulence, a lot of discomfort, and runny stool or diarrhea. As researchers have pointed out, nobody's ever died strictly of milk being toxic, in the sense that we don't have this gene, the MC1M6 gene, that's responsible for turning that lactase on and off. But when we couple that with other stressors such as disease and famine, the risk of becoming sick and dying is increased if we're drinking milk. So as for people who can process or can't process milk, 70% of people lack the enzyme to digest lactose in adulthood. Lactose intolerance, then, it would have prevented milk consumption for most populations. Now, I'll also point out that that's a theory. When we look at populations around the world, for example, those individuals that live in Mongolia, they drink a lot of milk and they do not possess lactase persistence. So they deal with, on a regular basis, the discomfort that one would experience as a result of lactose intolerance. So these ideas, they are challenged as well. And that's another important thing to recognize in the sciences and in the social sciences. When we construct theories, they are very much open to debate. In contrast, when we have a hypothesis and we're able to test that, we move to a level of knowledge that really somebody now needs to show is false, and that the reliability of those tests aren't consistent over time. So learning to refine milk, then, this is how it began. It wasn't a matter of learning to drink raw milk. So learning to refine milk was important for some people because really they started to have a relationship with animals in a fundamentally different way. So here, learning to refine milk, it was associated with populations who used resources in a particular way. I'm going to refer to Marvin Harris. He's an anthropologist. He's a founder of a type of school of thought referred to as cultural materialism. Pardon me. And he was interested in understanding the function of, for example, a number of these taboos that we see or that we know of within religious systems. For example, the prohibition for pork among Judaic individuals or Islamic individuals. The question becomes, why is there a religious prohibition against eating pork? Is it structural? Is it entirely ideological? Or is there some foundation here within the structure of society that ultimately can be connected to, and I'm going to jump to the end here, to resources and the way that we use resources? So Marvin Harris, he looked at the idea of the sacred cow, and his argument, to get to the gist of it, was the cow for people in India, it was of much more use alive than it was as an animal that would be consumed, because of the resources that the cow, in fact, produces. So, for example, the cow, it can be used as a traction animal to pull plows. Number one, that's a benefit to having cows. Number two, the cow, its feces or its manure is often used as a type of fuel. So there's a second advantage to that, to having animals alive rather than consuming them. In addition to that, the byproduct or the products of keeping cows, for example, milk, can be used to make ghee, butter, or yogurt, or cheese. So Marvin Harris began to argue, and theoretically, here again, we don't know for certain, but he said these ideas ultimately became rooted in religious systems because they served a function within society, important economic functions. The cow is of greater use alive than deceased as a source of meat. With respect to the pig taboo, he argued really the opposite. He said pigs, their milk haven't succeeded in any market around the world. No one uses a pig to pull a plow or to till a field. You can't ride a pig. Pigs are very expensive to keep. They require a lot of water, they require a lot of food, and they really place a burden, an economic burden on a society. So he said that's why the pig taboo, or the taboo against pork, emerged. So it's within these societies that start to use animals in particular ways as resources that we start to see resource management emerge within early societies around 11,500 years ago. All right, so here we're looking at the Fertile Crescent. This is where we have the birth of agriculture. And it ranges from Anatolia, for example, on the left-hand side of our screen, which would be modern-day Turkey, over into Iraq, and the Zagros Mountains on the right side of our screen. And we can see, based upon the type of environment, for example, people were likely to keep, here, let me get my marker here. People were more likely to raise cattle in environments that were suitable for that. And in the mountainous regions, people were cultivating, for example, goat. They were cultivating sheep around 9,000 years ago and goats around 9,000 years ago. In fact, it's in the mountainous regions that people during the Mesolithic, so prior to 11,500 years ago, that people settled as those changes in the environment began to take place. They were settling in the mountainous regions where rainfall was high. The crops, for example, Enkenhorn, rye, emmer, pistachios, a variety of nuts and seeds tended to thrive, and they started to become abundant. So people settled around those crops. They didn't create civilizations, they didn't create large villages, and they certainly weren't agriculturalists. They were individuals who foraged from the areas that they lived. And kind of the other benefit of settling around these new resources that were starting to become abundant was there were animals, and we started to use those animals. We started to keep those animals and manage them as a resource. At around, place it somewhere around 11,000 years ago, there was another event called the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas is a mini ice age, and it forced individuals out of the mountains and down into areas in Mesopotamia in search of water. And it's these people, for example, on the left side here, we'd have the Natufians. They progressed down into the area that we now know as Mesopotamia and settled around water. They trained the water, dug irrigation ditches, and they eventually invented agriculture. And we're not sure exactly how that happened. It might have been as an offering to the gods of the underworld. You take your seeds. Maybe they had an appreciation for how plants grew. Again, without stepping into a time machine, these are some of the elements that we can't pick up, but we do know, based upon the archaeological evidence, that they were in fact selecting for certain types of varieties of grains, for example, larger ones. So we start to see the archaeological record when it comes to the variety of grains. It starts to change from very small types of grains to larger grains, larger pistachios. So we know that they were now managing and controlling the growth of resources, and they were selecting the ones that tasted better, and those were the ones that they would choose to plant and start to create crops. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's taking place here in the Zagros Mountains as it relates to the Milk Revolution. So a lot of our information, it's coming from those folks that we refer to as bioarchaeologists, and another specialization that we find in archaeology that's called zooarchaeology. Zooarchaeology, it comes from the word zoon in Greek, which means animal. So this is animal archaeology. The individuals that are interested in exploring or reconstructing the invention of agriculture and reconstructing the history of domestication of animals, they're obviously interested in recovering those biological artifacts that were left behind, for example, at butchering sites. And they kind of engage in the same thing that a forensic anthropologist would or a bioarchaeologist would. When it comes to human remains, one of the things that we need to do is sort out the MNI, the minimum number of individuals. So you sort bones, you side left and right, and determine how many individuals are at any particular archaeological site that have been buried there or found in the burial. Next step would be to determine the biological or estimate the biological sex, for example, the goats or the individuals, and that gives us more information about that particular burial. Other things that we might do would include determining the age Okay, so something that's regularly used in forensic anthropology. Bioarchaeology would be determining the age at death of an individual. So the zooarchaeologists, in the same way that forensic anthropologists have specialized knowledge about human growth, the differences that we see between, for example, textbook male skeletal sex and textbook female skeletal sex, and obviously that's on a continuum. We shouldn't be thinking that there's a lack of variety, because there's a lot of variety when it comes to humans, gender, sex, the way that we understand ourselves. It is very diverse. And Charles Darwin told us that. He said, go back to the 1800s, 1857, we need to understand that all species have a great amount of variation, and that variation is necessary. It's important to the survival of all species. So we get this evidence from subsistence foraging, or evidence for subsistence foraging around or prior to 11,500 years. So prior to this time frame, when we start to see good evidence for dairying, we see an equal distribution of male, female, and adolescent sheep at butchering sites. And really that tells us that what's going on here is sheep. It doesn't make a difference what their age what their age is, young, old, if they're male, if they're female, they're all seen as a food source. After 11,000 years before the present, we start to see the bioarchaeological, the zooarchaeological record change. In other words, we see a different distribution of male, female, and adolescent sheep in the butchering sites. So after 11,000 years, we see clear evidence for resource management. It's observed in the zoo archaeological record. And I'll give you an example on the next page. So with respect to that milk revolution, we have some real good evidence. First evidence for dairying, and this is coming from the Zagros Mountains. So in between Iran and Iraq, a number of areas throughout there. So it's found in the Middle East, and we see this among early Neolithic farmers at around 11,000 years before the present. And what they discovered in these butchering sites, like I said, counting bones, assessing estimating the sex of those individual remains that have been found in these burials or these butchering sites, and the age of them, they discover an excess of adolescent cattle remains, an excess of adolescent goat remains, excess of adolescent sheep remains, whatever they're keeping at that point of time. If you refer back to a couple slides, I believe it was the second slide, that map of Mesopotamia, we see that the relationship or the distribution of males, females, adolescents, it has changed. And the question is why? What have they understood? Is it that adolescent cattle taste better, adolescent sheep taste better than ones that are old? It's not what's going on here. What they've begun to understand is these particular resources can be used as a source of food, and as adolescent cattle are taken away or adolescent sheep are taken away from the mothers, there's another resource that's left there for humans, in other words, milk. So this indicates that young cattle, young sheep, young goats were being slaughtered, and the mothers were being milked. So now that's telling us that individuals were looking for those resources. In particular, males, really they didn't, they were seen as a food source, but not as valuable as a reproducing sheep or goat or cattle. One, two males and a whole bunch of females to keep alive. Because the few males, they can inseminate the females. You don't need a whole lot of males for that process. Take away the adolescents, and now these females, the resources that would be going to the adolescents, that's used for humans, and we're also using the adolescents as a food source as well. So kind of doubling up the resources. Okay, I think we've looked at this at one point of time in our lecture, but I'm going to ask you again, if you don't remember, what is it? this is one of the questions a lot of archaeologists have when any archaeologist will have when they come across a pottery shard. What is it? What is the purpose of this shard? And at one point of time, we developed all kinds of theories about what this might be, any particular type of artifact. And the movement eventually became called processualism. So the idea that we can have objective truths through interpretation. Later on, another school of archaeological thought comes into play, and they are referred to as post-processualists or post-processualism. And they argue that no, an interpretation is just that. It is subjective. So one of the things in archaeology that we're going to do here is then we'll take the pottery shards, we'll put them together, piece them together, and reconstruct the object. So what is it? So this kind of looks like a cauldron to me. Sorry, a colander, not a cauldron. It kind of looks like a cauldron or a sieve. And we can ask, what is the purpose of this? And we could say at one level, it's entirely interpretive. I might argue it's a pasta strainer. Somebody said, well, did they have pasta back then? I don't know, but that's what it looks like to me. Okay, somebody else could say, well, maybe they were using it to shower. Maybe it was the early shower. You kind of take your pot of water that you might have and you dump it in here, and then you get it spraying out of all these little holes, right? How great would that be? This is evidence of the very first shower. Okay, it's a theory. You know, we're going to try to disprove that. So this became really cumbersome for a lot of archaeologists to say all we can have are theories. And really anthropology, because we kind of walk that borderline between the social sciences and the natural sciences, we want to be able to get to the point where we have hypotheses that we can actually test rather than just have our interpretations or our theories. And we're satisfied with the interpretations and theories, and we continue to refine them, you know, if that's as far as we can go. But when we can get solid evidence, we should do so. So some archaeologists began to think, you know, what if we can take a look at, for example, what's inside? Sorry, that's my poor eye today. What if we could take a look at what's embedded inside of that pottery shard? Because we know clay is porous. And maybe we can figure something out about this by engaging in a stable isotope analysis. You know, we've done this before. For example, we're be able to determine what people have eaten, what they've cooked in their pots over time. Maybe we can find residue in here to help support our theories. So the archaeologists that had discovered this, they thought, well, this perhaps is a sieve that's used for making cheese. Perhaps it's a sieve that's used for making yogurt. So let's take a look at this and see if we can find the lipids that we can associate with milk. So they engage in a stable isotope analysis, looking for those lipids, and kind of the basic idea here is milk fats, they're insoluble, they're absorbed into ceramics, so therefore we should be able to take a look at this, analyze it, and determine what is embedded, what residues are embedded in the pottery. And we can distinguish these fats from other fats as well. For example, you can determine whether or not a pot was used for cooking meat, if it was something that was used strictly for milk, even to the extent that some anthropologists have looked at pottery and they've determined that humans were cooked in this pottery. So from this type of research, we were able to derive evidence for raw milk consumption. We are not able to derive evidence for raw milk consumption because we know that what would have been happening first before anybody started to consume milk was probably using milk to produce something else, like yogurt or cheese. The other thing that we want to do after we've established the types of residue that are found in the ceramics, archaeologists started to look at human genetics and began to look for a lactose tolerance, and here we'll just say an LT, lactose or lactase tolerance gene. We'll come up with a slide with an example of the gene shortly. That that looks bad, MCM6 switch, that's responsible for kind of coding the gene that produces the enzyme. So a few pieces of evidence that we're after. So looking at the movement of dairying, we know, and I know this looks a little bit odd because it's in blue. Blue is land, white here is water. I don't know why they produce it this way. Anyhow, it looks odd. Anyhow, around 11,000 years ago, then we are in that Neolithic Revolution. And we're seeing evidence of dairying in the Middle East. By about 8,400 years, we start to see evidence that this type of dairying had spread to ancient Greece. And then by the time we get to about 6,500 years ago, we see well-established dairy economy in Central Europe. Right here, 7,500 years ago, this is kind of the critical point where we're able to get that genetic information that tells us that some significant changes had taken place on chromosome 2, so the second chromosome. So it's usually done like this, 2q, and about the 21st position and around there, and I'll show you that shortly, that these changes had taken place, permitting lactase persistence or lactose tolerance over time. So the LCT and MCM6 gene, as pointed out, it's found on the second chromosome. The LCT is position 21, MCM6 is 21.3 position, and that's right about here on the long arm of the second chromosome. So this LCT gene, it ultimately provides the instructions for making lactase. And like I said, lactase, it's that enzyme that's responsible for breaking down sugar. So lactase, it turns sugar into glucose, and glucose is absorbed. So when we don't have that absorption process taking place in our stomach, that's when we're going to get the flatulence. That's where we're going to get the malabsorption, the runny stool, the diarrhea. The MCM6 gene, it's a gene that controls the LCT gene's activity, and it really causes a decrease in the expression of this ability to process lactose after infancy. So it kind of shuts off. And the way I want you to think about this is we had talked about, for example, the Tibetan islands in our last lecture, the Tibetan, not islands, the Tibetan individuals who have increased capacity for carrying oxygen in their lungs. Lungs are a little bit larger. Their blood carries oxygen differently. And as I pointed out, that ability, it's only activated when an individual finds themselves in a high altitude, in a situation where hypoxia or altitude sickness, reduction of oxygen ultimately means you're dying. It kind of switches on. So at a certain age, the MCM6, it starts to switch off, and that ultimately produces lactose intolerance. So refined, here this should actually be lactose. Just looking at that lactose, put an O there. Unrefined lactose, it's fermented in the stomach. So that enzyme, it's responsible for breaking it down and turning it into glucose. If that process doesn't happen, the lactose, it's fermented, and that ultimately causes, with that fermentation process, okay, so it's bubbling up, it's going to cause diarrhea, it's going to cause gas, it's going to cause bloating, it's going to cause a lot of discomfort. We see this mutation, and like I said, we're looking for that evidence at around 7,500 years before the present, if we look back on that dairy diaspora map. around 7,500 years before the present. So archaeogeneticists, they began to look at the remains of individuals and reconstruct DNA, amplify that DNA, and they found that this MCM6 mutation, it began to occur in a few different areas around the world, probably for very similar reasons. So it doesn't seem to indicate that this is something that was passed on from one civilization to the next civilization to the next civilization. It seems to first have emerged independently in these populations, so a type of a convergent evolution, or what we've referred to as an analogy, and then obviously passed on genetically after it has emerged. So think back, we were talking a little bit about blonde hair. Blonde hair emerged in the Solomon Islands before it did in Europe. So the Solomon Islanders, they did not get that gene from Europeans. Europeans didn't pick it up from the Solomon Islanders. They were two separate evolutions, random, but ultimately has the same purpose. Same thing here. We have this mutation occurring because we all share the same gene, and random changes do occur, and by chance the same type of mutation occurred and provided individuals with an advantage. So now the question is, what is that advantage of drinking milk? So convergent evolution, as pointed out, the adaptation occurs where we see similar ecological niches. And we have this mutation that's selected for because of the selective pressures that are placed upon populations. So survival, ultimately. So the question is, how is, if milk doesn't, if you're lactose intolerant, if that doesn't cause death, well, then what is the selective pressure? As I pointed out, we need to think about other stressors and what was going on at that point of time. So I've mentioned that epidemiological transition, the first epidemiological transition, which means infectious disease becomes the major cause of morbidity and mortality in populations that are keeping animals and populations that are agriculturalists. So the explanation then, we say drinking milk on a regular basis, we can't use that as an explanation for how we became lactose persistent. It wasn't a matter of increased exposure over time. You know, I might remember my mom saying, okay, eat your broccoli or your asparagus or your Brussels sprouts. Eventually you'll get the taste for it. You know, you'll develop a profile, a different profile. And there is some truth to that. You know, talking about food here, they say usually you need to taste something, a new food, about 20 times before you're able to fully understand how that works with your own profile or become used to that flavor or accept that new type of flavor. Well, when it comes to milk and lactase persistence, it doesn't work that way. So while milk is toxic, then no one ever died from lactose intolerance directly. Okay, and that's the key word here. No one ever died directly from flatulating and having diarrhea and an upset stomach. We need to consider how those factors, when considered in tandem with, for example, epidemic disease or famine, what type of situation that would have placed as a stressor on individuals and a population, and would have it caused a selective change, or would have it been seen as a selective pressure, allowing for individuals with a mutation to kind of move through this model that Herbert Spencer and Charles Darwin talked about, survival of the fittest. So how does this increase, therefore, the fitness of individuals? And as I've also pointed out, you know, one of the other bits of information here to tell us that people don't die of milk poisoning or toxicity. You know, in Mongolia, they're lactose intolerant, LI, but they drink a lot of milk. So the quick evolution of lactose tolerance, it suggests that something, or lactase persistence, it suggests something killed off lactose intolerant people quite quickly. And like I said, we need to take into consideration everything that was taking place as people transitioned from traditional foraging types of individuals and economies to economy that was ultimately based upon keeping animals and augmenting the ecological system that we lived in. Therefore, stressors such as famine, disease, combined with, and that's the key word, combined with lactose intolerant individuals' gastronomical effects, it would have led to deadly bouts of diarrhea and dehydration during times of famine, during times of disease epidemics. So individuals that could drink raw milk, they survived. When we think about food and food insecurity or food security, we often think about the nutritional elements of food and how that impacts individuals. And it's absolutely correct to look at that. For example, the human brain, it requires about 33 times more energy than any other single muscle in the body. And this is why, for example, nutrition programs for school-aged children or anybody is essential. You know, if we think if we're starving a muscle of its nutrients, and that muscle being the brain, you know, how well can a child learn and function in school? So early morning nutrition programs, availability of resources, these are really important elements that anthropologists have worked on and advocated for. One of the things that often gets lost, and this is what Tina Moffat, for example, discusses in her article on food insecurity and culture, food's not always about nutrition, is she wants to point out the cultural elements of food and what's lost when food isn't available or food insecurity impacts one's traditional ways of eating, for example, or access to foods. And this is relevant for so many individuals from a historical perspective and also as we move into the future as well. In class, one of the things I asked, you know, was about what do you think when you hear that somebody is a vegan or somebody is a meat eater. Now, we shouldn't have stereotypes. We know that that's harmful. But people nonetheless do form stereotypes. Anthropologists, sociologists, they've asked individuals about the stereotypes that they hold when it comes to vegans versus, for example, meat eaters. And some of the things that tend to pop up is, you know, meat eaters, they drive pickup trucks, whereas a vegan or a vegetarian, they drive a Tesla or electric vehicle. You know, when it comes to politics, your vegans tend to be more socialist and liberal, whereas your meat eaters, they tend to be more conservative. Okay, maybe for some people, but I know individuals who are vegans who drive pickup trucks. I know vegans who are conservative. And again, you know, we need to be careful of those stereotypes. But if we examine the belief that people do hold these stereotypes, it ultimately comes down to this idea that food is symbolic. It does hold symbolism, and the types of eating patterns that we have, they are symbolic to other people. Now, if they're symbolic to other people, well, therefore, definitely they're symbolic to us in a variety of different ways. So that's what we want to tease out in this section. We want to talk a little bit about food culture, the identity that is associated with food, how food has been used to colonize individuals, and how food has been appropriated by colonizers, for example, and how really kind of going back to a lot of traditional ways of thinking are really important, I think, because the values that we find, for example, in indigenous belief systems, when it comes to food, everybody can benefit from those ideas. They are so important. And I'll come to traditional foods from the Assembly of First Nations shortly. So foodways then, this refers to the way that food is constructed. So foodways as a particular area of study in anthropology, it examines the role of food and food-related behavior in cultural groups. I don't know if you can hear my dog in the background and my daughter. They're both very excited to see each other. So foodways, they study the ways that food knowledge is transferred within and how it varies between societies. You know, what I'd like to think about quite often is a way to, impress upon students the importance that culture is embedded in a lot of the things we do. For example, if we went to Quebec and we talked about Bill 101, people believe that it is integral to the preservation of French culture, that their language is distinct, that their language is preserved. If we went to France, they would argue the same thing. There's a ministry that's responsible for language and culture. It's interesting because, food is the same thing. Culture is embedded in food, and we have to ask what happens when food or traditional ways of subsisting are taken away from people. How does that affect their identity? And you'd be kidding yourself if you think that food hasn't been used as a tool to colonize people. John A. Macdonald, I won't call him sir, John A. Macdonald used food to colonize and starve people. Food, therefore, we can say we are what we eat. Beyond that nutritional idea, okay, our culture is represented in our food. Our identity is represented in our food. The way that we transfer knowledge, our values, our norms, it's contained in food as well. So our foodways, with this idea that we are what we eat, kind of moving away from the nutritional to the cultural, it refers to our attitudes towards food. The way that people purchase food, they prepare food, they present food. I personally like to present food on a plate, have it plated. I like to do that at home. I like to I've tried to teach my kids and other individuals. I remember doing a seminar at Mohawk College about mindful eating, and I told people to play with your food. I think it's really important to play with your food and to be in touch with your food in a way that we're often not encouraged to, because it does encourage a type of mindfulness and a connection to what we're putting in our bodies. I also remember a story when I was working at a factory, an assembly plant, when I was in graduate school, and one of the individuals I was working with, his wife, she recently had migrated to Canada. He had saved up and finally brought her over. And he was telling me a story about the first time that she went to a large grocery store, and she was shocked. And she said, "Oh no, I don't think I can do this," and she couldn't understand or accept that we eat and she would eat meat that is packaged on a shelf rather than selecting, for example, the chicken and processing, preparing it in the way that she has been taught ever since she was a child from her mother, who was probably taught that from her parents, and so on. That knowledge, those traditions that have been passed on from generation to generation. And I think in Western culture, fast food culture, where everything speeds up, a lot of this is lost. And in losing it, people lose that ability. Not everybody, of course, but I think in general, we tend not to reflect on how this is important. We just eat. Let's eat that Big Mac, rather than thinking about the preparation of it, where it came from. So there's a lot of symbolic meaning that's been attached to food, ranging from, and here I'm thinking about the recent lawsuit that's been initiated in the United States, where an individual is suing, Buffalo Wings, some company, because they've been selling boneless chicken wings, and they weren't actually chicken wings. Okay, they were boneless, and it was breasts that were prepared in a way that they looked like chicken wings. And he said that's not okay. So there's a class action lawsuit. That's not okay because we're buying into the idea of chicken wings for Super Bowl, and this has impacted us. Okay, I think it's a silly idea because as the company referred to, they said, when we say buffalo wings, they're not made from buffaloes either. Um, there's certainly a deeper connection here to be made when we're looking at the symbolism and the connection that people have, or those deep connections, either to their cultural traditions, their identity, their religion, or past connections to their ancestors. So food, it does create a connection, therefore, between our beliefs, for example, those associated with religion, our ethnicity, and our cultural heritage. And when food isn't available, as Moffat has pointed out, traditional food isn't available, this does have a profound impact on people being able to practice something that they are entitled to. They're entitled to, in Canada and multicultural society, where our culture, religion, it is a protected status. People are entitled to practice that. But because of the, I don't know, the circumstances of a particular city, Toronto tends to be in the types of grocery stores that are there, availability much more diverse than other areas. So sometimes people find themselves in a situation where that food insecurity really is threatening their cultural identity. So the loss of foodways, then, it's going to impact the way people construct their identity over time. Okay, and here, for example, what ways do we transmit culture? We transmit culture through language. We know that. I've referred to that. We transmit culture through our clothing. We transmit culture through the jewelry that we wear. We transmit culture through our food. Plain and simple. Like I said, I'm going to refer to, and this is going where I'm going to leave our course. The last word is going to come from the Assembly of First Nations, because I really believe that it's been put brilliantly, and I don't really have anything to add to this. I think it sums up a lot of the problems that we have as humankind. It sums up the problems that First Nations people have had with respect to colonization, the problems that continue to exist in maintaining lifestyle as it's related to foodways. Okay, so this comes from, the paper is called Traditional Foods, Are They Safe for First Nations Consumption? Written by the Assembly of First Nations Environmental Stewardship Unit, March 2007. And here, under the heading Traditional Food Systems on page 2, I'm going to begin to read. They're talking about traditional harvesting. Traditional harvesting activities also contributed to physical fitness and health, strong cultural identity and values, and knowledge of land, environment, and way of life. Variations in traditional food systems and diets among First Nation communities in Canada is a result of differences in geographic locations, availability of food, species, proximity and access to animal migration routes, plant species, traditional hunting and fishing practices. Economically, traditional foods are more affordable in comparison to the high costs store-bought foods are, especially in northern and remote communities. Harvesting of foods also provides a means of economic livelihood through trading among other communities. With respect to the physical benefits, traditional foods are rich in nutrients and provide a good source of dietary needs for maintaining good health among First Nations people. Another aspect is the socio-cultural importance of the use of traditional foods. During traditional ceremonies, feasts, potlatches, and cultural events, there's a deep connection to one's cultural identity and spirituality through the consuming of traditional foods and the events leading up to it. Prior to eating, a plate of traditional dish is made and burned and offered to the Great Spirit and ancestors who have passed on to the spirit world. The symbolic value of consuming traditional food has become a more important marker for cultural identity. For generations, traditional ecological knowledge, including traditional food species, has been passed down to younger generations through oral teachings, storytelling, and experiences on the land. Traditional food consumption is deeply rooted in the social and cultural elements of a First Nations way of life. Many hold beliefs about the food healthfulness, and spiritual provisioning. They use food for its educational value and place it in the social fabric of community life. A little bit further on. From a First Nations perspective, the concept of health and well-being is viewed in a holistic approach, including the social, physical, emotional, and spiritual aspects of one's life. All these aspects are interrelated and continuously influence one another. Once harmony and balance is achieved among all aspects of one's life, then health and well-being is achieved.